ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the very last session at GLOBSEC 2021, Kathleen Koch.
Well, welcome everyone now to the final session of the GLOBSEC Forum. I would like to think that they saved the very best for last. Well, as we all know, this November, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, otherwise known as COP26, will be taking place in Glasgow. And this is the moment, of course, for countries to submit stronger climate commitments. In other words, what we call NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Now, yes, the United States has rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, but the title of our panel is Political Leadership on Climate Change. United we stand, question mark, question mark. So there's uncertainty about how unified the world is on this topic and what will the ramifications of disunity be? So we will be bringing our audience into the discussion, the audience in the room, that'll happen later on, but obviously our audience online, which there are some who are watching us on Zoom in the virtual studio or also watching us via the GLOBSEC app using Slido. You can type your questions in at any moment. Now I have a wonderful panel. One of our panelists isn't yet here. I will introduce her last, and hopefully she'll be able to join us. But who we have with us right now is, first of all, Jennifer Morgan. She is Executive Director of Greenpeace International. David Livingston, the Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. And hopefully, cross fingers, soon to be joining us will be Laurence Tubiana, who is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. So Jennifer, I will start with you. What is your reaction to the announcement that was made on Sunday at the G7 meeting, where the leaders did say that they are boosting their climate finance pledges? What do you think about that?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the G7 as a whole was a big disappointment for both climate and for equity across the board. The financing component of it was very, very weak. We didn't see very many new commitments coming in to fill the pledges of the 100 billion that developed countries had pledged years ago. And on the climate part as well, yes, there were good directional statements, and yes, it's good that we're in a different situation and having a president of the United States who understands the science, but we needed deadlines, we needed plans for those G7 countries of when they are going to phase out fossil fuels, when they are going to phase out the internal combustion engine, and we didn't see that. We saw a great commitment for international coal financing and phasing that out by all G7 by next year, but the vagueness just doesn't match the urgency at this point in time.
David, how would you respond to that? Why didn't President Biden and the other leaders, make a more detailed commitment?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm so pleased to be able to join this year's summit virtually. I hope to be able to be there in person soon. Let me just say that I personally thought this was actually a quite productive year for the G7 in terms of international coal finance. As was mentioned, there was a very strong signal that was not at all a foregone conclusion going into the G7. And thanks to, I think, some very constructive diplomacy, we were able to get a very strong signal that there will be an absolute and unequivocal end to international financing of unabated overseas coal this year. It's a very strong signal, and now it's important to take that and to press the other large remaining coal financiers globally to stop exporting unabated emissions from the dirtiest, most polluting power source that we have globally, which prevents other countries, the recipient countries, from really being able to step up and to lay out the climate ambition and climate action that oftentimes they would like to do. Now, when it comes to domestic emissions and domestic sectors, let me just say that I thought, again, there was actually some strong coordination across multiple different sectoral initiatives. So in transport, the United States and several other G7 members joined the Zero Emission Vehicle Transitions Council. The United States is going to be, we're only 100 days, a little bit more than 100 days into this new administration, but I know that colleagues at EPA, Department of Transportation, are hard at work rolling out domestic policies on the transportation front, and we look forward to watching that space. And as those get rolled out, I think you'll see even more specific policy action in the United States being added to the overall vision set by the G7. In the power sector, the United States continued to lay out its vision for a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035. Now, perhaps not all G7 members were able to agree on that, but we still got a call for an overwhelmingly decarbonized power sector in the 2030s. That speaks for itself. The necessary technologies will need to be deployed to the grid. We'll need to deploy and scale up new technologies that help us address emissions at existing fossil plants if they are to have a role to play in that decarbonized power sector in the 2030s. And we have to have a decarbonized power sector in the 2030s if we're to meet our 2050 goals. And then finally, let me just note that I think what was perhaps most notable is that this G7 didn't just tackle the low-hanging fruit or the easy opportunities, but also went to where emissions abatement is actually quite difficult. The G7 rolled out for the first time ever a standing group, a standing body on climate and clean energy, the G7 Industrial Decarbonization Agenda, which is focused on the hardest to abate sectors, and both supply side technological push as well as demand side pull for clean energy technologies, for green products such as green cement, green steel, et cetera, which will help lower the costs of those green products and processes that will be needed to decarbonize the industrial sector, which is oftentimes the most difficult and the most expensive in which to reduce emissions. And when we do that as the G7, we lower the cost of decarbonization, not just for ourselves and our own countries, our own economies, but also for economies around the world. And so I think that's going to be a very important step in showing the path forward in sectors like chemicals, steel, cement, fertilizers, et cetera. So I saw quite a bit of good in this year's G7. I think that these are not easy wins. These are hard-fought wins. We have much more to do. The proof will be in the actions that each country takes to implement this broad vision and some of the very specific targets and commitments and goals that have been set forward. We have to do more, but we also must set the tone and carry it forward into the G20 through COP26 and beyond this year in multilateral fora as well.
Thank you, David. Jennifer and David, can you both hear me? Can you hear me? Is my microphone working? Great, you've got me. Jennifer, I wondered, I'd like to take on some of the things that David mentioned. He talked about pressing on coal. Who do we need to press?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that there's some benchmarks that are being set, and I wanted to take, in Europe, I think it's clear that we need to press a faster decarbonization. The International Energy Agency has noted that developed countries need to phase out coal by 2030, right? So it's good the 2030s that's the problem. We have in this decade, in the next decade, we have to actually, according to the International Energy Agency, phase out that coal. And in Slovakia, I just wanted to call out the government here and say they're setting a great pace of sustaining a 2023 coal phase out. And so that means that other countries in the region, like Poland, like Czechia, like Bulgaria, Romania, need to move in that direction. Obviously, also developing countries need to move forward. And included in that is, of course, China, and looking to see how China, which it's so clearly in its national interest for air pollution reasons, for climate change reasons, economic reasons, to also be both stopping the funding of coal internationally and joining that G7 call, hopefully all coal, not just unabated coal. That's an important little word for people in the audience who follow this stuff, but also their domestic coal. So you need to look in that space. I think in India, you're seeing tremendous progress on solar, and just seeing how much better for lives and for the well-being of people and the planet that moving into a renewable energy future is important. And that's why I think it's key to focus on the technologies that we have now for those coal nations, and those include renewable energy. It doesn't include carbon capture and storage. It doesn't include air capture. It doesn't include many of these technologies that are more what we would call false solutions, biofuels, and really doubling down on that. And the good news is that the prices have dropped dramatically. The good news is those are great job creation opportunities. This is also about job creation and really being an economic driver for a much more prosperous and beneficial economy. Those are some of the places we need to be focusing on.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm very excited to say that Laurence Tubiana has been able to join us. Bienvenue. I'm so glad that the technology is working with us. I know that you've missed what both Jennifer and David have just said, but we were initially starting out by discussing the commitments made by the G7 on Sunday. And Jennifer said it was a big disappointment. How would you characterize them, the commitments on climate?
Yes, I think the good thing, of course, and I'm sure Jennifer referred to that, is having all G7 countries, which was not there before, committing to net zero by 2050. But what is more worrying is even if there are good progress on some of the G7 members, particularly UK, US, of course, and the other members of the European Union that are part of the G7, we still, of course, need particularly a country like Japan and just to go forward. And probably what is missing is the good thing is they decided to stop funding to support export to any coal technology, this is good. But they were not clear, finally, with a precise date of phasing out coal in the domestic field. And it's important because we know, and of course the G7 referred to IPCC, they believe in science, they say that we have to go to net zero by 2050. And you know, there is no miracle. And unfortunately, there is nothing that will happen in a way spontaneously in 2049. So this has the milestones, the pathway has to be consistent with what can be achieved progressively. And this is halving global emission by 2030. And of course, it's normally much more than that for the developed countries of the G7. So coal cannot be part of the picture. And they have to set a final date. So I understand the problems, the enormous elements of transition for a number of regions that are really the economy based on coal. But that's why it's not good to delay. That's what is good really to anticipate what has to be done to accompany the region to diversify their activities and not only, of course, the source of energy. It's important to see how you retrain workers. And that, if we delay that, the economic shock will happen in a much tougher way. So that's where I was disappointed by the lack of clarity of the G7. And I hope they would, in a way, take these 6 months to what's Glasgow to be much more precise on a number of sectoral elements, by the way, because they have to say things very clearly on transport and beyond energy. So again, good that the direction of travel is net zero by 2050, but what is very important is a clear pathway, and this, for the moment, is not there.
Merci. David, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on one point that you mentioned. You talked about by 2035, and I guess Jennifer implied that wasn't soon enough, that the U.S. power grid, the power structure would be decarbonized, and in large part by relying on new technologies. Is the U.S. relying too heavily on technologies that don't even exist yet?
That's a concern, and I understand.
If this could be for David also. This is a question for David to elaborate. Just a moment. Thank you. Can you hear me, David?
Thank you. I mean, let me just say, I think we absolutely already have technologies today that we can deploy to reduce emissions in the power sector. We can get extremely far with just existing technologies that we have today, even as we need to absolutely continue to innovate technologies that we'll need to reach deeper and deeper levels of decarbonization decades into the future. It's a false dichotomy to think about innovation versus deployment as some sort of choice that you need to make between the two. In fact, one of the best things we can do to drive further innovation in clean energy technologies is deploy at scale today. This is why the Biden administration is doing things like setting the hydrogen earthshot goal, the goal of achieving $1 per 1 kilogram hydrogen in 1 decade, 1 for 1 in 1. For the first element of the periodic table, clean hydrogen, which we're going to need in order to help not only decarbonize power, but more importantly, to decarbonize heavy industry, some long distance or heavy transport, et cetera. But the point is, we get there as well by deploying renewables, by deploying clean energy technologies, any zero emissions technology we welcome, because it can help create the power production base, the clean power production base. It can help drive green hydrogen and other clean hydrogen technologies into the system. So this is what we mean, is that it's not just what we do in labs, it's also about innovation through deployment, innovation through learning. And it's why you see this administration only 100 plus days into the Biden-Harris administration moving swiftly with the American Jobs Plan, with multiple other vehicles for making major investments in the energy transition in a way that empowers workers, and doing so also with a mind towards both going full speed on the technologies we have today to decarbonize, continuing to work on promising technologies that may give us new solutions in the future, but not letting the excitement we have about tomorrow's technologies and about technologies that are close to commercial scale but not quite there yet, not letting that prevent us from also moving swiftly ahead with the technologies we already have today. In many parts of the United States, it's more economic to deploy new renewables than, let's say, even to continue running existing fossil resources. And so, the market is already sending these signals to us. We just need to embrace it and move forward with policy, and do so in a way which seizes economic opportunity and prosperity, and then shares that in a very inclusive fashion across multiple different communities and with American workers.
Jennifer, I'd like to look ahead now to COP26. What are you feeling? What is your mood? Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? And what have we learned? What lessons learned do you think you can apply based on what we've experienced over the recent years since Paris?
Well, I guess I'm optimistic because I see so many people involved. I see, if you look at movements around the world, whether it be connected to the climate crisis, whether it be connected to racial justice, Black Lives Matters, whether it be related, to vaccine equity, you see people who are getting engaged, who are standing up, and who are really fighting for a better world. And I think you're seeing that in a way through elections. It's not often that you have, a youth movement that gives a mandate to a new European government. You see a new U.S. government with certainly, although I obviously think it needs to be further. It's, President Biden ran on the most ambitious climate plan that we've ever seen. You see people standing up in Poland, for example, farmers fighting so that there aren't new coal mines. That's what gives me really hope and optimism. And I think that will continue into Glasgow and certainly beyond. And it's an understanding that we really need to change the rules of the system, that there's something not working, that the short-term kind of economic benefits are coming ahead of really taking care of people and the planet. I think where I'm concerned, obviously, is the pace and scale of change that's required to avoid complete climate chaos, and that's why I come back to dates. I think we need to see in Glasgow a stepping up of all countries to the commensurate needs that the scientific community is telling us, right? Laurence mentioned that the halving of emissions by 2030 with the major lead by developed countries, but also developing countries coming forward on that. And we still have a ways to go there. And I think a key piece is really going to be about solidarity with developing countries. And that also goes across the board. I think if one message for our viewers, vaccine equity and supporting the TRIPS proposal in the WTO of South Africa and India, as the United States has done, is a key part of developing countries feeling solidarity and support in tackling these crises, climate and a pandemic right now.
Laurence, how would you characterize your mood? It's interesting, I was listening to a speech you gave in the fall I think it was in Poland, and you talked about how the United States, yes, had backed out of the Kyoto Protocol, had quit the Paris Agreement. Now the U.S. is back in the game. So do you have optimism? Can you count on the U.S. now?
Of course, yes. Of course, we cannot but rejoice from not only, well, mainly because, of course, U.S. very quickly, that was, I think, the first measures that President Biden took to come back to the Paris Agreement, where U.S. has been, of course, instrumental together with many other countries to agree to build. So that, of course, was a very good news. And in a way, we have to recognize that the previous administration has done a lot of damages, not because the Paris Agreement has exploded, it hasn't, but because, in a way, it has slowed down many efforts in many countries. I'm thinking of Australia, I'm thinking of Brazil, I'm even thinking in Mexico. So this was a bad factor. So it's a very positive factor to see the Biden administration coming in with, as Jennifer Morgan said, the most encompassing, ambitious climate plan that we have ever seen in the United States. So just 100% happy of that. Nevertheless, and that, of course, a responsibility of all, the concern we may have for Glasgow. And again, I do recognize that there is a movement which, again, I would not have anticipated so much. When we signed up the Paris Agreement, we put net zero emission by 2050 or soon after as a goal. And now it has, in a way, diffused that benchmark for many, many actors across the system. And now the IPCC is reinforcing that to get really to protect the global rise of temperature from beyond 1.5 degrees C, we have really to do that as early as possible. And this is a positive element, is that this benchmark is now the benchmark, even if, of course, countries or government or business are not only able to say how they would achieve that. The concern is, in my view, the problem of a rising divide, which was overcome in Paris between North developed countries and the global South. It's part of course, the COVID crisis and the debt crisis. It's part of the difficulty of having any sensible negotiation because of the context. It's part, of course, of the issue again and again on climate finance, because again, insisting on Tubiana as a private fund, which is absolutely fine because we need this private money to be invested in renewable energy, in sustainable transport, etc. But for many developing countries, the connection with these trillions is not happening because the access to capital markets is not there for them. So there is an element of distrust that has mounted. Of course, was very strong during the previous US administration, is now growing, and we haven't found the signs, the action that can, mend that divide. And I think that's a more urgent thing. I told that to many of your colleagues that I think the UK presidency, everybody has to talk to developing countries first to show what kind of solidarity we can demonstrate and prepare for Glasgow. It's like offering really a serious investment package for Africa, for example, or renewable energy, or facilitating for India the access to capital market to deliver their goals. So we need these actions. That trust is building up, and then every country, because every country has to make efforts, but every country has to feel that they are not alone, and it's not a rich people game or rich people club. And it's really important that we see that in a very comprehensive way. It's important that G7 make advance. It's important that G20 just again commit, and it can be a very positive move on the G20 side if things are going well. But we need a very inclusive process, because I can remember the ambition of the Paris Agreement was a result of the pressure of small island states and the less developed countries. the leadership is there as well. And many times we forget that the leadership comes from small countries, small power in a way, in the big game of geopolitics. And I think that's a message we should really make an effort to make this real by Glasgow.
David, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to Laurence, to Jennifer, and just to also help us understand what is the United States doing to help bridge that trust gap?
Thank you very much. I mean, in many ways, we're where we are, even with a passing shot at addressing this climate crisis, because of the hard work of Laurence and colleagues, years ago with at the instantiation of the Paris Agreement, the hard work that led up to it. So I know we're all very grateful for everything that has been done to date to give us the framework in which we can work to raise global ambition, which is exactly what this administration and Secretary Kerry in his role as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate is doing. Now, when it comes to climate finance, there's clearly a lot of time to make up, a lot of lost opportunities to make up. And this administration, again, just a little bit over 100 days in, is working to do that. President Biden's laid out a plan to double climate finance, U.S. climate finance, to triple adaptation finance, which it's very important that we scale up. There's not enough adaptation finance going around, and the U.S. is working to dramatically increase 3x the amount of adaptation finance that we have. You also saw the U.S. leading work towards the announcement at the G7 of a new $2 billion for the Accelerating Coal Transitions Program and other clean energy transition programs at the Climate Investment Funds, at the CIFs. This is meant to, as we, the G7, step away from having anything to do with public support for international coal. It's important to help countries with the financial resources and as well as the technical expertise and the solutions and technologies needed to transition away from coal in their energy sectors towards cleaner energy sources that, by the way, are going to deliver better benefits in terms of air quality and oftentimes also in terms of job quality in many of these economies around the world, including many developing countries. Now, in addition to this, we also need to be very focused on addressing where the largest are. It's not in the countries. It's not in small island states. It's not the most vulnerable. These are the ones that have most at stake in the future of the climate crisis, and yet they are often the ones the lowest emissions globally. Instead, we need to focus on the 45% of global GDP, which is not aligned, the largest economies, which are not aligned with keeping 1.5 degrees C within reach. The United States, Europe, the rest of the G7, indeed the rest of the OECD can do as much as it can, but we're going to need to help the rest of the world to come along with us together in addressing this climate crisis. I would like to remind the audience that all of the OECD economies' emissions combined are less than the emissions of just China. China's per capita emissions are quickly catching up to the OECD average per capita emissions. And so it's not to call out any single country, but it is to say that we need to also be serious about where the future of energy growth is, where the future of emissions growth is. It's not in the United States. It's not in Europe. It's in non-OECD Asia. It's in Africa. It's in Latin America. It's in Central and South Asia. This is where we have to work to bend the emissions curve. And we have to work hand in hand with these countries. We have to deploy clean energy goods and services that we have to offer in order to help these economies bend their emissions curves as quickly as possible. And in the meantime, while doing it, by the way, to bolster their economic and energy security. That's the only way to get countries around the world to buy into this transition. They have a stake in it. And so on that note, I'd just like to say, since we're at GLOBSEC, I'd like to highlight that the CEE region in Europe is an important place, not just to be deploying clean energy, but to become an engine of clean energy manufacturing. In fact, it's already the battery of Europe, the battery capital of Europe, in terms of building gigafactories that are going to supply batteries for the electric vehicle industry of Europe into the future. I'd like to see Central and Eastern Europe also become a trusted source of clean energy manufacturing in a full range of clean energy technologies that we in the United States, as well as our friends in Europe, can depend upon to feed the clean energy deployment we're going to need in our economies, but also around the world.
Thank you, David. I want to go to the audience now with a poll. We have a poll on Slido, so those of you who are on Slido, if you would pull it up, we want to talk a little bit about net zero. So this is the first question. How confident are you that your country will meet the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 needed in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C? So let's see how confident folks are that their country, their own country, is doing well and will meet the goal. Not looking very confident. Let's get all the results in. Okay. Fascinating. No one has said very confident. Well, let's go on. Let me write my notes here. So we've got a 50, let's see, or 47, 47, and confident 5, and very confident 0. All right, the next question. How confident are you that the world at large, in other words, will meet the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C? So will the world do a better job than your own country? How confident are you? Let's see, do we have the results of the second poll yet? I'm curious. Okay. Wow. Not a very optimistic group. So, and I'm not sure if my panelists can see these results, but what we are seeing, yeah, okay, you can see these. Wow. Well, let me take this now to you, Jennifer. There doesn't look like there's a lot of optimism out there. You know, what does it say to you?
Well, I think partially it depends on who the audience is. I think that I see more skepticism, I would say, in corporate and government circles than I do in other circles, because I see quite a lot of wanting to hang on to the status quo of where things are, and we've seen that happen. Very big fights for it for the recovery funds that have happened to hold on to the fossil fuel economy as we have it. So that's one question I would ask, because I think where I get my optimism from is not from government or corporate leaders. It's actually from youth. It's from people who are on the ground really trying to move to create a better world. That's one reflection. The second is that I think that there is still this myth that there's a dichotomy between having a prosperous economic well-being for people and taking care of the environment at the same time. And I think that we need to understand that those things come together. I think if anybody needs to hear an answer to that, you just need to listen to President Biden say climate change is jobs, right? And if you want to look at where countries that are moving forward and trying to bring these different crises together, you see that climate is at that center. But I think oftentimes you still see either misinformation coming forward on that or fear-mongering on that, but actually they belong very much together. And I wonder if that might be behind those numbers as well.
We got a really interesting question on Slido, and I'd like to share it. And our Slido viewer says, are we seeing political interest in cooperating with China on climate issues? Is there a complementary agenda on both sides? Laurence, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, as David said, we don't have the choice. No, we need to cooperate with China because if not, the climate crisis cannot be solved. All the issue is about so different options. Can we discuss cooperation with China while maintaining on many other sectors, whether human rights or trade or military or whatever? So of course, in classical geopolitics, no, and this is playing a role, of course. But on the other side, there are different movements. When you look at the Chinese society and even the Chinese leadership, I see that, and probably because of the new US administration, a discussion in China that was not existing even 2 years ago, and which were zero carbon and really the transformation, even the discussion about what we do with the pipeline of coal power plants is open, where I can tell you it was not open 2 years ago. So there is a positive effect of the global scene on China internal discussion, where in a way the genuine national interest on environment, because Chinese citizens want a cleaner air, for example, is gaining grounds that were, from the policymakers' perspective, not an issue. It was even a taboo subject sometimes. So I think this is open now, and I don't think we will see. So we have a window of opportunity. How to deal with that? I believe we have to, in a way, consider the climate crisis and the solution on many fronts. That's why, in a way, pressure from and action from the business, from the local authorities, is important to say that finally, if I can say something I believe so much, and I'm very happy to see the Biden administration in believing that if EU and US converge in many of their decisions on their economies, then the global markets will respond to that. And that will, in a way, be the best incentive for China to join forces and to decarbonize the economy, just to get the trade still open and to recognize that the demand in United States and Europe will be in that direction. And they feel, of course, the signal and they look at them. So I think maybe it's a practical cooperation, and of course the traditional, in a way, discussion between government has to continue. But we need a vivid discussion between companies, between local authorities, and as much as possible between citizens, that it is a common cause. It should not be a polarized issue where geopolitical interests are dominating, because that we can't find a solution. The zero-sum game, which is classical, of course, in power politics, cannot be, for practical reason, the response to climate crisis. And that's the same for the vaccine, by the way. So you cannot have nationalism if you want to solve the vaccine crisis and the COVID crisis, but you can't solve the climate crisis if you bet on nationalism. So giving the right signal, having a very united Europe and United States in the sense we give to the evolution of the economy and societies, I think it's a quite safe way, in my view. And you see that, I don't want to be too long, you see that the impact on the resolve of the United States and Europe on the investment in coal, where you see China reconsidering and many countries reconsidering, even in this region. And GLOBSEC is such an important platform for that. You see now countries that finally withdraw from big coal power plants when they have a discussion on investments with China and turn to other solutions. You have seen Greece, Serbia, and many others. And that finally China can respond into offering other things, and including renewable energy. So I do think that there is a space there.
I'd love to go to a question in the room. We do have our live audience, and if we have any more questions on Slido. So does anyone have a question? If you would, come to the microphone, or else I have one. Actually, David, I'm going to go ahead and ask you this, because there was a judge in Louisiana who made a ruling earlier this week, which is a setback, obviously, for the Biden administration, which had suspended new oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters. And the judge said that the president doesn't have the power to do that, that's Congress's power, since it was the branch that originally made federal lands and waters eligible for leasing. So to be too much of a hardship on the states that were trying to exploit the oil and gas, how do you push forward this global goal when you're getting so much pushback at home?
Kathleen, I'm not familiar with that individual case. I'd have to go back and look at it. In any case, it's not exactly in my specific portfolio. But what I will say is the U.S.'s climate target, including the 2030 new enhanced climate target that sets a goal of reducing emissions 50 to 50% by 2030, was the result of a very extensive consultation across the U.S. interagency, across the U.S. government, with external stakeholders. And it looked at a wide variety of different scenarios for implementation, knowing that we have a very unique and complex system of governance in the United States, a multi-layered federalist system that was, has been envisioned for certain reasons and has strengths, weaknesses, but has proved itself to be durable and to actually be able to achieve big things over the decades and the centuries. Now, a big part of that is indeed the fact that Congress is critical for advancing climate and clean energy goals, but so are states, so are cities, so are various other localities. One of the silver linings of the past several years, in which a different administration was perhaps not quite at the table on climate change and in a leadership position like this administration is the fact that you had a network of different non-federal government actors, governors, mayors, university presidents, labor leaders, corporate CEOs, all coming together to send the signal that they were still committed to the Paris Agreement and that they were going to chart out a course to try and achieve what is necessary to reach net zero by 2050, regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C. Now, that's a really powerful architecture that we need to build on. We have subnational champions at every different level. Regardless of what happens in any one individual court case, we have a much stronger architecture of subnational action as well as civil society and corporate action than we ever had even 4 or 5 years ago. So we need to build on that. We need to work with it. We need to not just harness it, but also empower it to go out and go perhaps even further than the federal government in many different ways, even as this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, sets out the most ambitious climate platform domestically and internationally that's ever existed in the United States. And so, when that happens also, we see it happening according to local economic logic. We see those that see an opportunity in manufacturing electric buses down in South Carolina going ahead and embracing that opportunity. We see those that want to play a role in providing the steel and the turbines for offshore wind at, let's say, revitalized shipyards and foundries in the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, at facilities in West Virginia and elsewhere across the United States, leaning into that opportunity. So coastal states, remember, aren't the only ones that have a lot to gain from the 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 goal that President Biden set. And so, if we empower and unleash those different communities, those different actors, outside of government and at different levels of government in the United States, I do think that we're still going to make significant progress towards the shared goals that we have, even as we work with Congress to, to reach those targets and to do it first and foremost by making investments first and foremost in the communities and in the technologies and in the opportunities we need to, because that will start to create the virtuous cycle of political economy that we can then build on. We got to get that momentum first, and we have to make those investments at home and in various different communities across the United States.
Jennifer, I'm going to give you just a moment to sort of give us your final thoughts, because we're down to 2.5 minutes. What is it that the key to success, do you think, at COP26, if there's 1-2 things that you can cite?
I think the first thing is that the UK presidency prioritize outreach and engagement with developing countries and works to make sure that the trust is built there, works to ensure that there's vaccine equity, that debt is canceled, and that there's a climate finance package there. I think they are on the front line. So that is one key thing. And the second I would just say is that the governments as a whole listen to people rather than the corporations. We haven't talked as much about that, but there are efforts right now underway by companies to set net zero goals. There's good net zero goals and there's not so good net zero goals. And so I think it will be fundamental to make sure that the companies that show up in Paris are really part of the solution, and they're not using false solutions like offsets to try and delay action. And that is a key piece, because it will empower governments also to be taking that type of increased ambition moving forward in this kind of job creating different system for the future, and the signal that can be sent that they're really serious and will get close, keep that 1.5 degree goal in sight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to my marvelous panel. You're hopefully everyone is going to emerge from this a little bit more optimistic than they were coming in. So thank you to Jennifer Morgan, Executive Director of Greenpeace International, Laurence Tubiana, CEO of the European Climate Foundation, and David Livingston, Senior Advisor to U.S. Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. And if everyone would please remain in your seats right now, because we are going to be joining the Maria Teresia stage for the wrap-up and the closing remarks of GLOBSEC 2021. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.